Hello students, I'm Dr. Neenu Gupta from the Department of English and Cultural Studies, Punjab University, and today I'm here to introduce you to cultural studies. A very important, a very much in relatively new discipline in which a lot of research is going on and there is a lot of research scope. And even if you're not interested in research, this faculty, this discipline helps you to be very aware of your surroundings because all of us are part of culture. So we can't deny that we can live without culture. We are a part of culture. That's how we live. So we will be dwelling into different sort of definitions and how do we understand. So though it's not very formally structured, but still I've done a bit so that you know how I'm going to go about it. So I've divided this lecture into 4 parts, in which the first part would be a general talk as I'm introducing myself and the subject, right, and the discipline of cultural studies, in which I am what is the importance and what are the advantages of studying or understanding or learning cultural study, right? And the B part, the second part, would be to draw a lineage of the word culture and how it ends up in cultural studies. So a span of around 150 years, right? Matthew Arnold to T.S. Eliot, through T.S. Eliot to Raymond Williams and contemporary studies, right? And the connecting B is the C part, in which we will be looking at how formalization took place, right? How the formalization of cultural studies took place in academia, in the literary world. And then D part would be an interesting part in which we look at the different types of cultures, because when we're talking about cultural studies, we are trying to deny and defy the fixed thing. So when we are trying to defy the fixed thing, that means we are allowing multiplicities to prevail, alternatives to prevail, others to prevail and have a voice, right? And last part would be the different type of cultures and of course a sort of conclusion. So as I have told you that it's relatively new, and how did it come to being? Cultural studies, what was the need of bringing in cultural studies? This was a response to modernism. Now, what happened in modernism? Until modernism, everything was structured, right? Everything was given to you, right? And in postmodernism, these old meta narratives, these old canonicals, I'm not sure whether the terms are clear, so I'll be just explaining in a line or two so that the lecture is comprehensible to everybody. So when we talk about canonical literature, or when we are talking about grand narratives, we talk about that. Okay, grand narratives would be the narratives or the books or the novels that were read by elite society, and elite society would decide what is culture, and only that would be culture or high culture, and everybody would, and everything else would not be culture, right? So we'll come back to that point later on. So this happened, but in postmodernism it was felt that you cannot, postmodernism and parallel we had post-colonialism also, where the other would be voiced, where the alternatives would be brought in, where the things that were not in dominance would, or power. So I'm bringing in all the terms we should be very familiar with, like dominance, hegemony, ideology, power play of Foucault, and of course the theorists, other theorists. So I'll be talking in a bit about them in short so that you get familiarized with these names. So the introduction to cultural studies was important because it was interdisciplinary in nature. So when you're looking at a particular thing, it would only, you cannot just isolate that thing. For example, if you're reading a novel or researching on a novel, you cannot just look at the plot. The setting of the plot is very much important. The at some point it was also, the novelist is very important, his background, the context in which he's setting up the plot, right? So these are the things which we cannot negate when we have to understand any particular novel, right? So even if we are not going to do any research in cultural studies, but still it makes us aware and conscious of the world in which we cohabit with other people. And also it tells you about that how society, cultural ideology is constructed. Now we just dwell upon this word culture, right? So normally if you find the definition, it would be culture is a set of beliefs, it is a way of life. So if you just think about culture and had it been an interface, you would have given me answers about it. Okay, ma'am, how the way of life, how I dress, right? And what religion I follow, what are my food habits, right? So these all are mix into culture. Now the cultural studies looks at it as politics of production and consumption. That if you develop certain food habit, right, then or you have a certain belief system, then it is not individually yours, but it is very much result of your you as a consumer. So that means it is not naive, but it is produced. There is rather the politics of production and marketing behind your choice, which you think you are making. You think you're liberal to make choices, but you are made to you're made to choose that. So there are many examples we can talk about from the advertising world, right, in which cultural celebrity culture or the commodification of celebrities also comes into being, right? For example, if you look at an advertisement and then that looking at that advertisement, especially if it is being promoted by your favorite star, would introduce, would give birth to a certain desire in you. So it's not need based, it's not value based, but it is the market based, right? So you may not need that thing, right? And you may not look at the value of that thing, but you would still go and search for the thing and buy that thing because it has been endorsed, and you are made to feel that you should be in possession of that, right? So in this all the whole brand culture also comes in. So I always, most of the times I give example of Marks and Spencer and the other brands that lure youth here, right? Even little brands like Being Human and all. So these Marks and Spencer cloth line may not suit the skin of Indians, but because it's a brand, so when you're buying something from Marks and Spencer, it is not that you need, you may not be comfortable many a times, but you are buying Marks and Spencer because you want to show people that you can afford that brand, right? So more examples, more interesting examples can come later in the talk. So what are we doing when I'm talking about these brands, when I'm talking about advertisements? So you are analyzing advertisements. So if you look at the advertisement of a car, so when it's a Mercedes Benz, then you will not find a family who would be shown. A middle class family would not be shown which is going in for Mercedes Benz, but there would be a very very girl would be there next to Mercedes Benz, and many a times you must have noticed that you fail to understand what is being advertised, right? So that is the marketing technique, because they're just targeting the rich class, they're targeting the business people. So it's not a family car, right? But if they are going into the smaller versions of cars, then they would be showing the emotions of a son for an elderly mother, or newly wedded couple going to daughters, going to wife's place and all, so they are just tapping in the emotions, and that is what we are investigating into. So cultural studies allow us to investigate the constructed categories of identity, authority, and knowledge. All these three categories, we feel that we are liberated. We have choice to, we have our own identity, right? We have the authority to choose, and we have knowledge from which we can make choice of how do we live our lives. But this is not so, right? So now how it came into being, right? So Matthew Arnold gave us this, talked about culture, but his definition of culture was that what best is thought and said in the world. For Matthew Arnold, that was the culture. And now, when that means that whatever elite class was doing or was preferring would be culture, and rest is not culture. So high culture is only high culture, right? And uh, this view on culture remained for a long time in 19th century, even till the mid of 19th century. Now, through industrialization, Marxism. So coming to Marxism, if you are familiar with the base and superstructure model, we have economy at the center, right? Economy and base superstructure. In base and superstructure, economy is at the base, and it determines superstructure, and culture is a part of superstructure, right? That means culture is dependent upon economy, right? But economy is not dependent upon superstructure. And culture, all the cultural activities, whether all the art forms, music, painting, all the traditions, all the institutions, they all fall in superstructure, right? This is what Marxism believed. That means Marxism was being authoritative. Like Matthew Arnoldian high culture, that means it would be fixed. That high culture would always be constant, right? High culture would always be consistent. That whatever rich are doing, whatever people in power are doing, would be high culture, and other whatever is left is not high culture, not even culture, right? So similarly, Marx, whatever is economy is at the base, and whatever else is at the superstructure or the periphery, and it does not actually influence economy. That means there is a sort of fixedness. So one important thing that cultural studies and understanding of cultural studies we do is that we are trying to read into the dynamics. So one thing, before, I have already told you that there is more than the dominant culture, and that cannot be negated, or those cannot be negated, because there are more than one, right? And secondly, high culture cannot be fixed. There is always a dynamics involved which can bring the alternatives in. So we will be talking about this structuring principle in a bit, right? So now I come to that how this came into being, and there was always a division between high culture and low culture till 1950s, when in Great Britain there was a group that evolved, who began into, and these were the theorists that came themselves. They were from working class, and they jumped into F.R. Leavis tradition, right, in which they brought in this idea that culture is made by the majority of the people, not the minority of the people who are dominant, but it is made by the working class people. So we have here Richard Hoggart, F.R. Lewis, Raymond Williams, Country and the City, his book, written in 1958, Long Revolution. And then we also have E.P. Thompson, who talked about who has written a book on the English working middle class, right? So these are all around 1950s and 60s when they got together, right? And they talked about that we cannot ignore the alternatives that are available in the society, and there cannot be any one rule that is universally applicable. So there cannot be any scientific objectivism, right? I'll just elaborate it a bit because it is very important. It's just, if we are, judiciary gives one rule, yes, we follow it, but we know that that one rule cannot be applicable to all, right? Now here I'm reminded of Indian philosophy, Indian darshanas, I would say, not even philosophy, because philosophy is again one term, Western term that compartmentalizes and becomes authoritative, right? So we in Indian darshanas, which is a form of philosophy, we have six systems of interrogation, right? Of evaluation, that you cannot just depend upon one thing and universalize it for all, because every rule, every individual, every deed of an individual is contextual. So we are bringing in multiplicities for anything to be constructive, for anything to be for prosperity. It has to be um, it has to undergo the discourse and dialectics. So I am introducing two more things, two more terms: ideology, dialectics, and discourse, which are very important to understand cultural studies, and of course hegemony. Antonio Gramsci talked about hegemony. Hegemony is when there is a dominant, the idea of the ideology or the aim that is given by the dominant power, and it is infused in the society in such a way that you're made to believe this is right for us, because otherwise it would be dictatorship, right? So in the ruling parties, what they do, they make you feel that this is for your welfare. So the ideology is there, their ideas, they get diffused in the society as their own. You think that it is for my own benefit, it is my own idea, right? So this is hegemony and ideology. And dialectics is given by Hegel. So dialectics is when when you are being countered, or your argument is countered by other voices. So you can't just snub those voices and say that you are in power, but you allow the other voices to come into into play, so that they can counter your argument, because the purpose behind this is that whatever comes out of the Hegelian dialectics would be agreeable to all the parties, sort of, right, who were contesting with each other, and that would be benefit for all. Now, very importantly, again, I'm reminded of Vad. So we don't have, the debates and discussions as they're the Western concepts. In India, we have Vad culture. So Vad is a sort of, discourse that, okay, if I have to speak something, you can dissent, you can add to it, but that should not make me angry, right? I should be very accommodating and inviting the counter arguments, because I know that I have to satisfy, if I have to over if I am very confident of my argument, then I have to satisfy the counter arguments, and if or it will give a broader understanding of where I am wrong. So the base at the base of this vad is that you will get a very productive result, right? So coming back to the efforts that the people, the theorists who were very concerned about the working classes, now what their aim was to make the working classes conscious of their surroundings, the politics that ruled um, the the circuit of culture. Circuit of culture is again a term that's given by Stuart Hall, in which he talks that there is a circuit of culture that is going on in a society, from production, desire, marketing, consumption, and this goes on, right? So these they wanted now, and Raymond Williams has talked about again very the concepts he's given very good terms of dominant to residual, right? So dominant is something which is dominant, as the name suggests, which is in power, but as T.S. Eliot talks about society and Raymond Williams talks about culture, that whatever is apart, dominant, like in base superstructure model, dominant is in the center, but there are other forms of societies or cultures that are at periphery. And very importantly, when we study cultural studies, we are taking this inclusive approach. We are trying to understand that we cannot just be blind to the peripheral structures, peripheral cultures, peripheral politics, peripheral societies, because there is dynamics involved. Whatever dynamics in a society, I'll give you example of politics to make this thing clearer, that whatever is in the center, I've told you it's dominant. So let's say it's some political party. So we cannot ignore that there are other political parties who are also at the periphery. Periphery means they're not at the center. And out of these parties, there would be some parties who partially agree to the dominant party's ideology. There would be other who don't completely agree. There would be some who would completely disagree to this. That means there are dissensions, there are contentions, and there are some sort of there's some sort of instability in the whole structure, which will not allow dominant to rule forever. So it's not fixed, right? Now what happens at the periphery, whether it is culture, whether it is society, whether it is music, whether it is cinema, whatever cultural practice, fashion also comes into being here. Whatever is popular here in the center would at periphery, and so, like if long kurtas, they are not in vogue, right? And nobody wants to wear that, then we know that after 10 years that would become the center, that would be something which would be fashionable, and the shorter ones will go into periphery. So in politics also this happens, that the parties that are at the periphery, so according to their own interests among them, there will be some parties who are completely different, and there are some parties who can just form a coalition because they have a similar kind of ideology, or they can compromise. So depending upon their condition, and it can vary from 1 year, it can from one day, from a one moment to lots of decades, right? To to bring in that revolution, or to bring in that change, when something which is on periphery will come in the center and push that dominant in the center to the periphery. So I'm going to explain it again. What I'm saying, that in a society, in a culture, what happens, there is something which is known as dominant. Dominant is something which is in power. And Foucault and Stuart Hall, Raymond Williams, they are all of this opinion that when we are talking about culture, culture is not a simple way of life. It's not that. It's culture is a complex process. It is very importantly, it's process. It's not something which is fixed. It will move on. So there is dominant in the center, and at the periphery we have different cultures, we have different societies, uh, like we have subcultures, we have countercultures, we have popular culture, we have mass culture, we have celebrity culture, all sorts of cultures, right? Now these cultures, they would be just, maybe, and they can be, uh, subculture can be something in the youth, youngsters, they don't want to obey in dominance, right? But they are not harming dominant in any way. Then there can be a counterculture. So counterculture is trying to just sort of intervene in the working of dominant, right? And so we have different type of cultures. So what I'm trying to say is that these cultures, either singularly or in coalition form, they can subvert the matrix. They can come in the center at any point of time and push whatever was in the center to the periphery, and the roles are reversed. That means every subculture, everything that is in the periphery will become uh, dominant and refute its own presence, right? Because once it becomes dominant, then it would not have that meaning for which it was fighting for, right? So this is the importance of culture studies, that we look at these things, and these people, I'm coming back to Lewis Hogarth Williams, who in 1958 they formalized this discipline by opening up a exclusive center for cultural studies in Birmingham, and with the aim that the culture has to be looked at the way of life working culture lead. One, working people lead. Secondly, working people should be trained to interpret, to look at the politics of the surrounding culture, right? And third, um, uh, you know, it was after globalization, there was globalization, that individual and subjectivity is also important and cannot be negated, right? And then there is another term in that comes with ideology, that is false consciousness. As I told you, that we are made to believe that this is right for us. That is what advertising world does. It produces false consciousness in us, which actually prevents us to recognize our own oppression. Okay, like if in a domestic scene, we have a domestic help, right? And we try to sort of please that person by giving more wages and all, but then that person it will prevent his recognition from oppression, right? Like if in the advertising world, the fair skin creams and all, they become, that means we are accepting certain thing, then we buy that product and we know that that's not going to give any result, but still we buy. So that's false consciousness that is being talked about by Antonio Gramsci. So what basically cultural studies is doing is shift. It's shifting from meta narratives or grand narratives to mini narratives. Okay, you speak, I speak. People on blogging, media has also played a very central role in bringing in different type of cultures and acceptance. So what cultural studies did in postmodern and post-colonial time was that it broke that centeredness, right? That essentialism, right? As we are trying to understand that it is a process, the process which constantly shifts and it operates between the closed containment and total domination, right? It's just as we are living in the COVID era where either we have containment zones or we are free, right? But then that we have to operate between these two. We cannot be totally liberal or totally dominant, or we cannot be totally contained, right? And it is very important to understand that cultural studies itself is not a theory in itself, but it is rather, um, it looks into cultural practices as intersection, right? Culture, it takes up various issues in cultural studies, right? Now I will so this is what it does. That means when we are talking about the peripheral nature, the minorities, we are talking about that there are some sort of oppression, there is some sort of social inequality that is prevalent in any society, and cultural study is looking into the political aspect and how it is different. It is a sociological study, not aesthetic study, but it is different from sociological study because it is done through literary criticism. And literary criticism looks into the politics of construction, production, dissemination or marketing, and consumption, where they all are semiotic and signifying practices or discourses, right? Now, when I'm talking about that, it we are moving from fixedness to a process. Then, how culture study helps into looking at this, and where is the shift, and how do we practically do it? Now, we'll try to understand with the definition of text. Now, in the modern times, what did text mean? Text means something which is written. But in cultural studies, text is any mode of representation. It doesn't have, it is not in fact canonical. So any mode of representation means, for example, what pen I'm using, what color I'm wearing, what clothes I'm wearing, how I'm speaking. So this is language also, Saussurian studies. Yes, Saussure talks about language, how language and culture they are related, and how language is also a social construct. Like if I'm shooting a video and I'm supposed to talk to postgraduate student, and I'm talking about cultural studies, then I have to make a choice of words that are allowed in such type of interaction. And when I'm talking to a friend or my family, then the choice of words can be actually not a choice, or they can be a very different type of it can be a very different type of language, and they can be very different so it's a social construction. It has the cultural dimensions, even the language, right? So what we do, going back to text. So text is any mode of representation in cultural studies. And what will this do? Because as it is interdisciplinary, when we look at a certain object, for example, we have a pen, or we have something, maybe a glass, or some attire. So we are trying, we have coffee houses, we have cafes, right? So we take that object and try to read or analyze. For example, if we take cafes, so we analyze that how the cafe culture is different in two different cities, for example, maybe three different cities. So we can take cafe culture at a place like Jalandhar, or at a metro in Delhi, or it can be a cafe culture in an educational city like Chandigarh. So you can dwell on a different type of questionnaire and look at that what is the difference in a footfall in different cafe, what are the reasons, what age group goes in, why do they go, why, how they afford such expensive coffee and all, right? So but this is that we are looking into, we are taking it as a text and we are reading it and analyzing it, right? And then we are looking at that, okay, how this is produced, how it is marketed, the whole economy, how it is involved, right? What is the politics, what type of people go to cafe, right? At what time do they go, how the desire is produced. So we are trying to analyze it sociologically, objectively, form, structure, content. So we're trying to create meaning of the cafe culture. What we have done through cultural studies is we are mapping the relations and connectedness, right? So that means cultural studies is committed to understanding power, relationships of culture, power, context, how we understand and how the knowledge is produced. So I think I'll move on to the last part in which I'll familiarize you with certain concepts and terms and talking about different type of cultures, right? Maybe if the time permits. Uh, so now what has happened is that we have moved from globalization to localization. If in globalization we moved to McDonaldian culture, sort of, it was McDonaldization of the world, that wherever you went you wanted to have McDonald burgers, and you were there were chains and chains that came into being, right? So this was known as Fordist model till 1970s, when it came into crisis. Fordist model is that, okay, uh, Buddha, the icon comes into being and the desire is produced, then multiple, there is production in industry of Buddha, everybody's buying Buddha, 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 clothes, baby Buddha, that sort of. This is a Fordist culture, right? Which is from the car production, right? So because markets got saturated in 1970s because of overproduction. So what was the crisis? That, okay, now we don't want the main thing, but we are looking into the alternative. Like the East was an alternative to the Euro-American economy, sort of, and small batch customization. So the movement from the globalization to localization, where the local industries also wanted to proliferate and make the global presence, right? So this is globalization, and this is how cultural studies came into being, all right? And then we have some theorists. I'll just explain in 2 or 3 lines their concepts so that you understand them better. So I've talked about Antonio Gramsci, and he gave the term hegemony and ideology, which are correlated. So hegemony is that hegemony is homogenization of ideology, right? By the people who are in power. And ideology is that you are trying to throw your ideas of the others, but it is not revolutionary, it is not violently done, but it's by raising the false consciousness that people feel that, okay, this is right for them, right? And now we have Pierre Bourdieu, who talks about cultural intermediaries, that when we are talking about production and we are talking about consumption, there is cultural intermediary. For example, the same pizza, if you talk about, it would have a different sort of catering to the demand of the place. It will be very different in Middle East, it will be very different in India, and it will be different under the same McDonald, or under the same pizza shop chain. There would be they would be made according to the indigenous taste or the local taste, right? So the cultural intermediary is very important term, that whatever is happening in economy, whatever is being produced, it has a symbolic value, it has a metaphoric value. So when you are, as I gave example of Marks and Spencer, or any other thing, you are doing it because it has a symbolic value, right? It has that metaphoric value, not the literal use value, right? So I've talked about Boodoo, I've talked about Antonio Gramsci. Stuart Hall gives Circuit of Culture, that this is the whole circuit of desire, production, marketing, consumption. And Stanley Fish also gives a very nice concept of interpretive community, that how that signifier becomes representative, right? So because we are working within interpretative communities, where we receive and that thing gets consumed, right? So we may not bother about these terms much, but these were very much relevant to the study of cultural studies discipline. So I'll just end up this by giving you example from popular culture, that how popular culture is important. So we know popular culture is like movies, how the shift, a very classic example of the shift from a culture, so-called high culture, to popular culture, or it can happen in reverse also. So what I mean by that is, as I gave you that model of base and superstructure, something which is in center and something which is at a periphery. Shakespeare, the Shakespearean plays were not for elites when they were staged, but now we know that Shakespeare is a very serious kind of he's a playwright, right? So there's a shift from popular culture to the serious culture, right? And there are reverse. Normally, it happens the other way, right? So what I'm trying to say is that the definition which stated that culture is a particular way of life gets demobilized or get mobilized by popular culture. Popular culture says it is something which is widely favored. So it cannot be a particular way of life, it can be a residual which is moving to the center, right? So it's not fixed, it is mass produced, right? So I'll end this on by giving you a very interesting example of given by Pramod Nair, the example of mall. Now we all go to mall, right? Now how a mall can be a subject of cultural study, and it's a lot of variants. When you enter mall, it is a space of consumption. You just spend money there, right? It's a symbol of modernization, systemization, consolidation, right? Modernization, systemization, and consolidation, where you get everything under in one building, under one roof. You can buy any brand, right? And you can buy anything. And it is sanitized city for strolling. See, it is a very secure and very clean city where you can enjoy ACs and move around in hot summers, right? So you can stroll, you may not buy anything, which is otherwise very difficult when you go to a shop and shopkeepers are ogling at you with the hope that you're going to buy something, right? It is a very secured, guarded place, right? And it is also an escape. In some cases, it's just an escape. You don't want to do something, you go to mall, right? So that means it is a sort of hyperreal. Hyperreal is again a term that's given by Baudrillard. Hyperreal means you think it's real, but it is fantasy, it's utopian. Dream that, okay, you can buy, you think you can buy, but when you go, you're not able to buy much, right? And there is always a never-ending fluidity. Shops would never be empty. There would be fluidity of everything, right? It's postmodern secular space. So, you don't look at, sometimes which you tend to do, you don't look at the religion. You don't, but not look at the gender. You don't get narrowed down, but you get expands, because one shop has lots and lots of people who are in service, right? And it is an icon of globalization of culture, right? And last but not the least, it is in hybrid. It's an hybrid where you go as an escape, you go because you just want to meet people, you want to take stroll. So it's an hybrid where you just go to eat, right? And it's not only that you're going to shopping, but you're also trying to sort of whale away your time. Sometimes you just want to be with your friends, right? So it's an hybrid, and sometimes you just go to gaming zone, watch a movie. So it's a mall which is supposed to be a shopping mall, but it may be that you visit it without shopping at all. So I think I'll have to conclude here by, so the concluding remarks on cultural studies is it's something which is applicable, which is very much applicable to any damn thing in which you are situated, right? So it deals with a variety of historically and geographically located cultural formations, and cultural studies concerned with the construction, signification, and resistance of individual groups in relation to dominant cultural formations. Methodology is unsettled, and that means it's always questioning itself, and that is what I talked about, that it is a process which keeps on, and we are looking at the shifts, but we also are being alert and aware of the politics of construction. Politics, it's as much politics of theorization as it is theorizing of politics. So here I end my lecture on cultural studies. Thank you.